Growth in our carbon footprint has kept pace with our growing use of energy and our improving quality of life. But our growing carbon footprint may also be affecting the Earth's climate. Today, the desire to reduce our carbon footprint is revealing new opportunities for economic growth. How are today's investment decisions creating a path to the low-carbon world of tomorrow?
Funding provided by the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, the members of the Energy and Environmental Research Center's Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership demonstrating safe, practical CO2 management, and the members of Prairie Public.
There is a huge dependence on energy in our country, both for our quality of life and our overall economic prosperity. And a large portion of that energy production is out of fossil fuels, which are carbon-based.
Economic growth is usually tied into greater emissions, so reducing those emissions while still growing becomes one of the big issues.
Carbon market trading is an economically efficient means to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases.
Carbon market trading puts a price on something that previously was free, the ability to emit carbon emissions into the air.
Carbon markets are really part of the solution. They allow money to flow from willing investors to projects that are going to make a difference in this climate change arena.
Europe isn't as far ahead as people think, and the U.S. isn't as far behind. There is a revolution going on here.
Our story begins with our need for energy and our ability to transform our world. Since humans first harnessed the power of fire, we've used carbon-based fuels to meet our energy needs. Burning a carbon-based fuel like wood, coal, or oil produces a large amount of heat energy. It also releases water vapor and carbon dioxide. Composed of one atom of carbon and two atoms of oxygen, carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a gas that transports carbon through the environment. As a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide also helps keep our planet warm enough to sustain life. We call the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that humans release to the atmosphere, much of it in the form of CO2, our carbon footprint. The more greenhouse gases we release, the larger our carbon footprint grows.
The whole world has changed a lot in the last 200 years. We moved from a society which was largely agrarian to a society which was more and more urban. The quality of life improved dramatically. Opportunities for people from all ranges of life were enhanced. And I think one of the key elements has been our ability to learn how to use fossil fuels on a large scale.
There is a huge dependence on energy in our country, both for our quality of life and our overall economic prosperity. And a large portion of that energy production is out of fossil fuels, which are carbon-based. So our transportation fuels, the fuels that generate electricity, and even fuels to contribute to other industrial processes are all based on carbon to a very large degree.
From our baseload standpoint, we use coal. About 80% of our generation does come from coal. When we burn fossil fuels in a plant, we produce electricity, and that's a good thing. But in the process of producing that electricity, we are also producing CO2, which is a major greenhouse gas.
We have taken an enormous resource, captured it in a sense, learned how to use it. But the one thing we forgot about in that whole equation was there is no free lunch. Quality of life is significantly improved, but it's all based on a cornerstone of tremendous use of natural energy resources.
For more than a century, the world's industrial economies have depended on fossil fuels, but there is growing evidence that the carbon dioxide generated by the use of fossil fuels may be affecting the environment. Carbon dioxide, a major greenhouse gas, plays a significant role in climate.
Over time, there's been a cycling of CO2 in the atmosphere, and also at the same time a cycling of temperature. And we know this from ice cores from Antarctica. The difference now is CO2 from burning fossil fuels is adding CO2 to the atmosphere at a rate where it's accumulating.
Burning fossil fuel adds ancient carbon to the balance of carbon established in the atmosphere through the natural carbon cycle.
The Industrial Revolution was built on fossil fuels, and so a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere. As countries' economies grew, their CO2 or carbon footprint grew as well. The concern is that CO2 from human activity, or anthropogenic CO2, is going to continue to accumulate in the atmosphere, and since it is a greenhouse gas, the atmosphere will continue to get warmer and warmer.
Since industrialization began, the CO2 content of the atmosphere has increased by 1/3, and the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere has increased 1 degree Fahrenheit.
The industrial economies of the world are putting out most of the CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The U.S. accounts for about 25% of the CO2 that's currently being emitted to the atmosphere.
The carbon footprint of the world will continue to grow as more and more countries industrialize.
CO2 from the rapidly developing economies in nations like Brazil, China, and India is really increasing at a rapid rate.
China has just recently passed the United States in CO2 production, with a great deal of growth ahead of them as they try to reach the same quality of life and energy efficiency and utilization that we have for their overall prosperity.
The obvious challenge is China and India. Their priorities are to bring as many of their people out of poverty as quickly as they can. They both sit on large amounts of coal. They don't want to face restrictions on using that coal. The challenge globally is to allow China and India to develop in a way that doesn't endanger the climate.
To address climate change concerns, we may need to reduce the world's carbon footprint.
Economic growth is usually tied into greater emissions, so reducing those emissions while still growing becomes one of the big issues. I think they will need some type of mechanism that will allow people to invest in India and China and reduce emissions.
This is a global issue. A reduction in carbon dioxide here in Washington, D.C. counts the same as a carbon dioxide emission reduction in Singapore. It affects the atmosphere in the same way.
Reducing our carbon footprint means changing the way we create and use energy. This change will take a significant investment over a long period of time, and carbon markets will be a critical component of this change. Carbon markets finance a broad range of actions intended to stabilize the overall CO2 level in the atmosphere.
We can achieve this through emission reductions. Emission reductions can occur either through reducing the amount of CO2 that's emitted to the atmosphere or pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere.
A company can make an investment to reduce its emissions, or it can purchase emission reductions from others through a market mechanism called emissions trading. Emissions trading also helps a company when selling its emission reductions to others who want to reduce their carbon footprint.
One of the elements of carbon markets is emissions trading. Let's take two companies, Company A and Company B, and they have carbon dioxide emissions up here. What emissions trading suggests is that we really want you two companies to lower your emissions down to here. But this company over here, it costs them $100 per ton to reduce its emissions 1 ton. This company over here, it's $10 a ton to reduce its emissions 1 ton. So if we ask everyone to reduce their emission tons at the same time, 1 ton, it would be $100 on this company and $10 on this company, and now the market paid $110. In emissions trading, we transact between these two companies. This company might reduce its emissions not 1 ton, but 2 tons. And so now we still have a 2-ton reduction in the total reductions, but now it's done at $20 instead of $110 in the earlier example. Now what that means is where the total tons for the two companies is the same, but the price, instead of $110, is $20. And that makes goods and services cost less. That's emissions trading.
Company A could represent an efficient facility that uses less fossil fuel to manufacture products. It could avoid emissions by producing energy from renewable sources such as wind. By growing trees or grasses, Company A could take CO2 out of the atmosphere. The carbon emissions avoided or offset by these actions are called carbon offsets, because the carbon removed from the atmosphere by the project offsets or cancels out the carbon being emitted elsewhere. Any actions that reduce our carbon footprint can produce a commodity called a carbon credit, which is the amount of carbon that is not emitted to the atmosphere. Carbon credits are also called certified emission reductions. Carbon credits are the basic trading unit of carbon markets and are usually expressed as tons of carbon.
Projects financed through these markets could take on the form of wetland restoration projects, injecting CO2 into deep formations here in the continental United States. Projects focused on bagasse in Brazil, investments toward forest restoration projects in rainforests. They might involve no-till agricultural practices. They might focus on renewable energy projects such as wind or biomass.
The whole process associated with generating carbon credits, I would say, takes 4 or 5 steps. You have to identify a project sponsor, and a project sponsor that is involved in some activity that will generate emissions reductions. After that, you quantify the emissions reductions based on some approved methodology. The third step is to get what we call validator to validate our quantification, and this is done by an international auditor. After that, the carbon credits are ready to be sold into the market.
The markets are really a place where investments can flow to projects that achieve the desired reductions in carbon through the most economical means or through things that might have ancillary benefits.
Carbon markets have been developing since the early 1990s. Today, carbon markets are supporting a growing and diverse portfolio of projects in countries around the world.
It's 3 years old.
You have the Kyoto Protocol, where you have binding constraints on the European Union, Russia, Japan, Canada, Australia, where they actually have commitments. But you have the United States taking more of a market-oriented approach, voluntary approach.
A particular driver has been the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, which has generated possibly up to about $7 billion for investment in projects in developing countries that reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So already we're seeing the carbon market, largely private sector money, generating substantial investment in environmentally sound projects in the developing world.
Most of Kyoto's Clean Development Mechanism projects are quick wins. In other words, they produce offsets that reduce carbon emissions right away at a relatively low cost.
The goal of the Clean Development Mechanism is to reduce emissions where they are cheapest to reduce. That means countries like Germany or France, they have a so-called cap under the Kyoto Protocol, so they need to reduce their emissions compared to the 1990 levels by a certain amount, percentage. Now, whether they do that in the country themselves by increasing taxes or subsidizing research and development, they can rather use that money and investing it in a country where emission reduction costs less.
And the low-cost carbon credits generated by the Clean Development Mechanism projects can be used by the industrialized country to offset their emissions.
So the projects today we see happening under the Clean Development Mechanism are mostly in countries like Brazil, India, China. Those are the big players.
Among the most promising Clean Development Mechanism investments are projects that generate electricity using wind, water power, or biomass instead of fossil fuels.
You mill the sugar cane, and you have the melasse, and you have the bagasse. The bagasse is the biomass that is left out of the process. Normally, sugar mills have tons of bagasse that they don't do anything with. And today, they can burn that and sell electricity to the cities where they are located. When you turn on a biomass, a gas-fired power plant, you turn off a natural gas or coal-fired plant. And by doing so, you're reducing emissions.
Another way to produce carbon credits is by converting methane to carbon dioxide by burning it.
Anthropogenic methane is typically produced by landfills or concentrated animal feeding operations. So one excellent way to develop carbon offsets, and is commonly being done today, is to capture that anthropogenic methane, which has a fuel value, and so you can burn it for energy, and convert the methane to CO2. By doing that, you're taking a greenhouse gas which is 20 times more powerful than CO2 and converting it to CO2. The resultant reduction in greenhouse gas effect can be sold as carbon offsets.
Landfills are very big in Brazil and elsewhere. Pretty much the same concept as the pig farming industry. You collect residues from households and they generate methane. We capture the methane and we burn it. So that is enough to generate carbon credits.
These carbon reduction projects have other benefits as well.
Every project has to discuss the effect on the sustainable development of a country. In Honduras, for example, it is very important that there is no deforestation, that they do something with regards to community benefits like access to water or electricity. And that's another beauty of the clean development mechanism. It helps countries achieve their emission reduction target, and it also helps countries to achieve sustainable development.
Clean development mechanism projects in the developing world have been instrumental in helping some industrialized countries meet the mandates set by the Kyoto Protocol.
We've seen in countries that haven't ratified the Kyoto Protocol, such as the US, there's been a lot of interest in emissions trading and climate change issues, and indeed there's a lot of regional development in the States happening, which is very promising for the future of the carbon market.
In the U.S., carbon isn't regulated, but what we've seen emerge are corporations and individuals that want to become carbon neutral or they want to reduce their carbon footprint. So what's emerging is interest on behalf of corporations of buying credits to reduce that carbon footprint, in addition to their own efforts to reduce emissions.
The Chicago Climate Exchange, a voluntary carbon market in North America, is helping major CO2 emitters to find offsets in the farmlands of the northern Great Plains.
The Chicago Climate Exchange is an emission reduction and management system. It's a group of 225 members in a financial institution where the members agree to reduce by 6% in 2010 from the 2000 levels. If they cannot do it, they promise to purchase the reductions of other people or to purchase from people who have trapped them or prevented them from going into the air.
The carbon emitter purchases the credits through the market. Many of these credits come from farmers or landowners who create carbon credits by capturing CO2 from the air using crops and native plants.
A lot of the carbon that's produced by the plant is stored underground in the root systems, and that carbon will remain there and build up in mass as that prairie grows and is left undisturbed. And really the only way that it'll be released is if that land is tilled and exposed to the atmosphere.
Through the purchase of carbon credits, the farmer and landowner are paid to keep carbon in storage while they continue to graze livestock and produce traditional crops. Ducks Unlimited is among the organizations developing carbon credits in the United States. Ducks Unlimited works with landowners on land management projects in grasslands, wetlands, and forests to increase the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These projects include determining the amount of carbon that will build up in these restored landscapes over time, and then packaging and selling these carbon credits to investors.
What Ducks Unlimited's program is doing is compensating the landowner for not releasing that organic carbon, for basically keeping it in the ground, and then continuing to use the grassland as pasture or hayland.
The carbon market is very intriguing for us, in part because of its multiple values. We think that Ducks Unlimited's work of restoring grassland areas, planting trees to capture this carbon, is entirely compatible with our mission of protecting the big landscape. It achieves great wildlife values for us, but also is a tremendous means for capturing atmospheric carbon.
Converting methane to CO2 or using land management practices to reduce the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are quick-win solutions good for the short term. But industrial economies release billions of tons of carbon each year, much of it from large-scale energy generation facilities. Reducing carbon emissions from these facilities will require a broad range of actions, including new technologies.
In the industrialized world, there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure already present, and it can be very expensive to offset carbon in these already developed nations.
So we have to find ways to reduce the carbon footprint of existing infrastructure, and one of the ways is to capture the CO2 that's released and to put it into storage in a permanent manner, such as in geologic storage areas.
Since the 1970s, carbon dioxide from natural geologic deposits has been injected into oil-bearing reservoirs to extend their producing life.
Today in the U.S., 2.5 billion cubic feet per day of carbon dioxide is bought and sold. Now, of that 2.5 billion cubic feet per day, 94% of that market is the production of large quantities of CO2 that are purchased, transported, and injected into the ground in order to produce crude oil from enhanced oil recovery.
Anthropogenic CO2 used in place of natural CO2 for enhanced oil recovery can help reduce our carbon footprint.
In terms of the individual project economics, there's a lot out there which is interesting because it can be quite profitable. One of the things that you would look at would be enhanced oil recovery, where you take CO2 from, let's say, a coal-fired power station and you put it underground in an oil field or a gas field, which is in decline. And what that does is it increases the pressure in those fields and it helps you take more out faster. And that provides a nice economic incentive for a company to invest in these technology.
The current techniques used for enhanced oil recovery can be used to store anthropogenic CO2 permanently underground. Putting CO2 into underground geologic reservoirs is called geologic CO2 sequestration, or carbon capture and storage. The CO2 could be stored in depleted oil reservoirs, deep unminable coal seams, and deep saline reservoirs. Each ton of this stored carbon creates a credit that can be sold on the market. In this way, the cost of implementing sequestration can be financed through the sale of carbon credits.
Apache Canada Limited is injecting anthropogenic CO2 into the ground in northwestern Alberta for enhanced oil recovery. That CO2 is going to remain under the ground after the project is finished. There are many economic and environmental benefits to this.
I think it will play a major role. There's great interest in geological sequestration, where companies who emit carbon dioxide can capture that carbon dioxide and pipe it to a geological reservoir and bury it in the ground.
Now, as we're looking at building new power plants, we need to seriously consider what the environmental ramifications of those plants are going to be. We're going to approach the reduction of greenhouse gas from a number of different angles. Part of that matrix is going to be looking at carbon capture and sequestration technologies.
So fossil fuels have been around for a long time. The fact that the world has a lot of carbon-based fuels makes it the fuel of choice for years. We cannot just flip a switch and shift from how we're doing things.
The first challenge is to become truly global, because that will address the competitiveness issues that industries will complain about. The European steel industry will simply not tolerate having to cut emissions by 30, 40, 50% if its competitors in Korea, China, Brazil don't face the same targets, or the United States for that matter.
The future will be companies coming from places we never thought would come, seeing a way to make a delivered product more efficient, have a lower carbon footprint, and a ready market of people wanting to buy that type of a product.
We've seen a huge amount of increase both in the interest on the technological side and an interest on the trading side. And both of those together mean carbon has very much become a real commodity that people are interested in, a real commodity that people will trade.
The market is so creative. There are projects being registered today. 5 years ago, I would not have thought that those were the first projects, but there is a clever person that finds out how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and manages to get this project through.
Dealing with what we thought was a major environmental problem is opening the doors for major investment opportunities in a valuable resource.
Funding provided by the U.S. Department of Energy, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, the members of the Energy and Environmental Research Center's Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership, and the members of Prairie Public.